The man in room 11 had been at the hospice for 3 weeks before he spoke to me directly. He was 78 years old. The staff called him Walter. He had no listed next of kin, no regular visitors, no one who called to check on him. He was quiet in the particular way of people who have made a decision about silence, rather than arrived at it by circumstance. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but the silence of someone who has decided that most of what could be said does not require saying. I had brought him tea on perhaps a dozen occasions. He accepted it with a brief nod. He looked at the window. He did not invite conversation, and I did not impose it. On a Thursday afternoon in October, he looked at me as I set down his cup and said, "Do you know a woman named Dorothy Crawford?" My mother's name. My mother who had died 12 months earlier. My mother who had raised me, who had kept a phone in her bedside drawer as a final act of evidence, who had been the best person I had known in 62 years of knowing people. I set the teapot down very carefully. I said, "Yes, I know that name." He said, "I thought you might. You have her posture." She always stood as though she had decided where she was and intended to stay there. He looked back at the window. He said, "I knew Dorothy Crawford 40 years ago. Before she was Dorothy Crawford, in fact. Before the marriage. Before the child." He said, "I am the reason she found you."
My name is Eleanor Brooks. I'm 62 years old and I live in Connecticut. I've been volunteering at the hospice since December of last year. I began because I wanted to be useful in a direction that had nothing to do with attorneys or courtrooms or the long administrative aftermath of 2.5 years of discovery. I wanted to sit with people who needed company and provide it simply, without agenda. I had not expected the hospice to provide me with anything in return. I had not expected to carry a cup of tea into a room and hear my dead mother's name from a man I had never met. But I have learned over the past 3 years that the things I do not expect are not finished arriving simply because I have stopped bracing for them. If this story stays with you, please subscribe and leave me a comment below. Tell me what city you are watching from. I read every single one. Now let me tell you what Walter knew about my mother, and why he had been keeping it for 40 years.
I had continued volunteering at the hospice after Agnes died. Not from obligation. The shift I had been assigned could have been covered by someone else, and no one would have thought less of me for stepping back after the intensity of what had happened in room 7. But I had found, over the months of Thursday afternoons, that the work suited something in me that had been looking for a place to settle. The quality of attention required in a hospice, the specific presence of sitting with someone at the end of their life without making that presence about yourself, was something I had been practicing, in one form or another, for 3 years. I had become good at it, good at the stillness, good at the listening, good at being in a room where something significant was happening and not requiring that significance to resolve into something manageable before I could remain present with it. I kept the Thursday shift. New patients came and went in the way of hospice patients. The rooms turned over with a regularity that could be shocking to someone who had not yet learned that the pace of endings is its own kind of rhythm, one you adjust to rather than against. Walter Oakes arrived in September. 78 years old, prostate cancer, advanced, being managed for comfort rather than cure. The admissions paperwork had the same blank where family contacts were supposed to go that Agnes's had. A blank that meant either no family, or family who had been lost, or family who had chosen a distance that was not purely geographic. The social worker made her twice-weekly visits. His medical care was arranged and funded. He did not ask for anything beyond what was provided. The nurses described him as cooperative and uncommunicative.
He took his medication without complaint. He ate what was brought. He slept in the patterns the illness produced. He looked at the window with the focused inattention of someone whose real looking was happening somewhere inside. I had seen that quality before. In Agnes, in the weeks before she grabbed my wrist. A person who appears absent, but is in fact conducting a private review of something, taking stock, deciding. I did not push. I had learned from Agnes that some people in hospices are waiting for the right moment rather than being unreachable, and that the difference between the two looks identical from the outside and reveals itself only in time. I brought Walter his tea every Thursday for 3 weeks. He accepted it. He nodded. He looked at the window. On the 3rd Thursday of October, he looked at me instead. I had just set the cup on the bedside table and was straightening up to leave. I never lingered in rooms where the patient had not invited conversation. This was a discipline I had developed and maintained. When he said, "Do you know a woman named Dorothy Crawford?" I had heard my mother's name spoken by many people over the past year. By Lucas, by the grandchildren, by the friends who called to say they missed her, by the hospice chaplain at her service, by Robert and Miriam who had never met her but knew her name as part of the story of how they had found me. I had heard it in every register and context a name can be spoken in, and I had learned to receive it without the particular catch that had made the first weeks after her death difficult. I did not receive it this way now. He had said it the way you say a name when you are not certain how it will land. Carefully, with the specific attention of someone monitoring for a reaction. I said, "Yes, I know that name." He said, "I thought you might." He said, "You have her posture." She always stood as though she had decided where she was and intended to stay there. I have been watching you come in with that tea for 3 weeks and thinking about it. I pulled the chair from against the wall and sat down. I said, "How did you know Dorothy Crawford?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of reluctance, the silence of someone organizing what they are about to say into the right order. He said, "I knew her before she was Dorothy Crawford. She was Dorothy Ellis when I knew her. Before the marriage to Gerald. Before any of it." He said, "We were young together. Not romantically. I want to be clear about that. It matters to the story. We were in the same circle. A particular group of people in their mid-20s in this part of Connecticut in the mid-1960s, before lives had fully separated into what they were going to be. People who knew each other through work, through other people, through the specific overlapping of paths that happens in a certain kind of young life before the paths diverge." He said, "Dorothy was the kind of person who made you want to be better than you were. Not through pressure, through example. She was simply more thoughtful than most people, more considered. You noticed it, and it made you aware of your own lesser consideration." He paused. He said, "She wanted a child for a long time before she had a way to have one." I said, "She and Gerald had difficulty." He said, "Yes. And in those years, we are talking about the late 1960s, early 1970s, the options available to a couple in that situation were limited in ways that are hard to explain to someone who did not live in that time. Adoption was possible, but the formal channels were long and uncertain, and Dorothy had already spent years in uncertainty. She was not a woman who bore uncertainty gracefully. She bore it, but not gracefully. He looked at the window. He said, "I knew someone. A man who handled private arrangements. Not a lawyer himself, but a man who worked alongside several lawyers who managed private adoptions for families who needed discretion. He was a connection, not a close friend. The kind of person you know in the way you know people who are useful when circumstances require a specific kind of assistance. He said, "I told Dorothy about him. I said there may be a way to move more quickly if you are willing to pursue it differently." She asked what that meant. I explained what I knew. He said, "She pursued it. And it worked. And you arrived." He looked back at me. He said, "Dorothy asked me never to tell you. She said the adoption was complete and legal, and that the origins of how it came about were not relevant to your life. She said she would tell you what you needed to know, and that what she told you would be the truth as far as it went." He said, "She made me promise. And I kept the promise for 40 years. He looked at the window again. He said, "She died last year." I said, "In October?" "Yes," he said, "I know. I saw the notice. And I understood, when I saw it, that the promise had a natural end."
I sat in the chair beside Walter's bed and thought about what he had just told me. My mother had known for 40 years that there was a man who held a piece of the story of how I had come to her. She had asked him to keep it. He had kept it. And now he was 78 years old and dying in the same hospice where she had sent me to volunteer, which she had not known she was doing because she had suggested the hospice months before her death without knowing that Walter would eventually arrive there. Or perhaps she had simply understood, in the particular way she understood things, that the world is smaller than it appears, and that the things she had set in motion decades ago would find their own resolution eventually. Dorothy Crawford had been, above all things, a woman who understood that the truth finds its way. She had trusted that. I said, "Tell me what you know. All of it." He nodded once. The nod of a man who had been waiting for exactly those words. He said, "The man I knew, the one who handled private arrangements. His name was Edward Marsh. He was not connected to Horace Finney, the attorney your parents used officially. He operated in the space between the official process and the families who needed something moved more quickly. What he did was not illegal exactly. It existed in the ambiguity of what was and was not regulated in that period." I said, "How did it work?" He said, "Edward had connections to women who were in situations where keeping a child was not possible. Young women mostly. Women who would come to him through various channels. He maintained," and he paused, searching for the right word, "a kind of informal register. People who needed families and families who needed people. He moved them toward each other with more efficiency than the formal channels allowed." I said, "He knew about my biological mother." Walter said, "Yes. He knew about Cecile." I was very still. He said, "I did not know her name until later. At the time, Edward told Dorothy only what was necessary. That there was a child, that the mother was in circumstances that made keeping the child impossible, that the arrangement could be completed quickly and legally through Horace Finney once the parties were aligned." I said, "Edward Marsh connected Cecile to the formal adoption process." He said, "Yes. He was the link between the informal network and the official one. Horace Finney handled the legal documentation. Edward handled the connections that made Horace's work possible." I thought about Agnes, about a room in Western Connecticut in 1962, where a 21-year-old woman had held her daughter for 45 minutes. About the attorney named Horace Finney, whose records had been sealed when he died in 1989. About the private arrangement Dorothy and Gerald had pursued because the formal channels were too slow. Edward Marsh had been the connection between Cecile's situation and Dorothy's need. I said, "Did Dorothy know about Cecile?"
The woman who gave birth to me. Walter said, "Not at first. Not the name or the details." Edward worked with discretion. Both sides had privacy. That was part of what he provided. Dorothy knew there was a young woman in difficult circumstances. She knew the child was healthy. She knew the legal process would be complete and clean. That was what she was given and what she accepted. He paused. He said, "Later she knew more." I said, "How much more?" He said, "I don't know exactly. I know that Dorothy was a woman who investigated things she wanted to understand fully. I know that over the years she made inquiries. I know that at some point she had a name and a general understanding of the circumstances. I don't know what she did with that knowledge. I know she never came to me to discuss it, which told me she had decided to carry it privately. I thought about Dorothy carrying the knowledge of Cecile the same way she had carried the knowledge of the voicemails, quietly, completely, without burdening me with it until the right time. Which for Dorothy meant never, or at least not in her lifetime. She had trusted that the right time would come after she was gone. I said, "Did you know what happened to Edward Marsh?" Walter said, "He died in 1997. He had operated for perhaps 25 years. I don't know how many arrangements he facilitated. Many, I think. He was not a man who did things in small quantities." He said, "I have thought about him over the years, about what he was. He was not a bad man by any conventional accounting. He moved children toward families who wanted them, and he did it legally, or close enough to legally that it held. But he operated in a world where the people with the least power, the young women, the Ceciles, had the least say. The decisions were made around them more than by them. Edward facilitated what the time allowed. Whether the time allowed the right things is a different question." I said, "Dorothy never told me any of this." He said, "No, she was clear with me that she would tell you what she chose to tell you, and that what she chose would be the truth as far as it went. I think she believed the origin of how the connection happened, Edward, the informal network, the speed of it, was less important than the connection itself. She had you. You were hers. The mechanism that produced that outcome was a detail that did not serve you to know." I said, "She was not wrong exactly." He said, "No, she was not wrong. But she was also Dorothy, which meant she made the decision herself and informed you of the result. That was her way. That was exactly her way." I sat with this for a moment. Then I said, "Why did she ask you specifically to keep it? You were not the only person who knew." He said, "I was the only person still in her life who had been there at the beginning. Edward was dead. Anyone else from that period had either lost touch or passed on. I was the remaining thread." He said, "I saw Dorothy occasionally over the years, not frequently. At community events, at gatherings of people who had known each other for decades. We were cordial. We did not discuss it. But she knew I held the thread, and I knew she knew. And there was an understanding between us that the thread would be held as long as she needed it held." He said, "The last time I saw her was about 2 years before she died. She was at a garden show in the fall. She looked well. We spoke briefly. She asked about my health. I asked about hers. As we were parting, she said," and he paused, the particular pause of someone reproducing exact words rather than a paraphrase. She said, "If something happens to me, Walter, and you find yourself with the opportunity to talk to Eleanor, tell her what you know. I think she will want it. I think she will know what to do with it." The room was very quiet. Outside, the October garden was in its particular late stage. Not the dying of summer, but the preparation for winter. The specific, organized withdrawal of a garden that intends to return. I said, "She knew you might end up here." He said, "She couldn't have known that specifically. But she knew I had been diagnosed. We had spoken about it at the garden show. She knew my situation was moving in the direction it was moving. She may have understood, in the way Dorothy understood things, that the paths would find each other eventually." I thought about my mother at a garden show 2 years before her death. 81 years old, still going to garden shows, still precise about the things that mattered to her. Saying to a man she saw occasionally across the span of 4 decades, "If you find yourself with the opportunity, tell her what you know." She had trusted the opportunity to arise. She had been right. I said, "There is something I want to tell you about Cecile, about what happened after." He looked at me with the careful attention of a man who has just understood that the conversation he prepared for is going to contain more than he prepared for. I told him about Agnes, about room 7 and the wrist and the decision I had made in 2 days, about Robert and Miriam and the phone call and the journals and August with the kitchen table that was too small. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said, "Cecile found a life." I said, "Yes, a good one, I think, from what Robert and Miriam describe." He said, "I'm glad. I did not know what happened to her. I only ever knew the beginning of it." I said, "She spent her life hoping I was well. She wrote to me every birthday for 30 years without knowing my name." He was very still. Then he said, "And were you? Well?" I thought about the question honestly, about all the ways it could be answered, and all the ways those answers intersected with each other. I said, "Yes, genuinely. The life Dorothy built for me was a good one, whatever the mechanism that produced it." He said, "That is what she would have wanted to hear." I said, "I know." We sat in the October room for a while longer without speaking. Not the uncomfortable silence of 2 people who have run out of things to say. The comfortable silence of 2 people who have said what needed saying and are letting it settle into the space where it belongs. Eventually, I picked up the teapot. I said, "Can I get you more tea?" He almost smiled. He said, "Yes, thank you." I called Lucas that evening. He answered on the first ring, which meant he had been expecting me to call. I had texted him from the hospice parking lot saying only, "Something happened today. I will call tonight." He had learned, over 3 years, that this particular phrasing meant something significant rather than something urgent, and that significant required waiting for the full account rather than immediate response. I told him everything Walter had said.
He listened in the way he always listened now, completely, without rushing me toward the point, without offering interpretations before I had finished building the picture. He had become, over 3 years of Thursday phone calls from parking lots and kitchen tables and garden benches, very good at receiving information before responding to it. When I finished, he said, "Edward Marsh, the informal network." So there was a layer between Cecile and Horace Finney that none of us knew about. I said, "Yes." He said, "Does it change anything about the adoption itself?" I said, "Patricia will want to review that question. But from what Walter described, the adoption was processed legally through Finney, regardless of how the connection was made. The legal document is what it was. The origin of the connection is a separate matter." He said, "I meant for you.
Does it change anything for you? I thought about that. I said, it adds to the picture. It doesn't change the picture. Dorothy was Dorothy. She found a way to do what she needed to do because she was a woman who found ways. The fact that the way involved a man named Edward Marsh and an informal network rather than purely the official channels, that is a detail about the mechanism. It doesn't change what was built with it. He said, that sounds like peace. I said, it is, or close enough to it that the difference doesn't matter. I called Patricia the following morning. She listened with the focused attention of a woman who is simultaneously receiving information and assessing its legal dimensions. When I finished, she asked 2 precise questions about what Walter had said regarding the legality of Edward Marsh's operation. I answered what I could and told her I would ask Walter more specifically at the next visit. She said, if the adoption was processed through Horace Finney and the documentation is what your parents held, there is almost certainly no legal issue. The informal network was the connection, not the process. But I want to confirm. I said, I know. I'll go back on Thursday. She said, Eleanor, how are you with this? I said, I am well with it. Genuinely. My mother made a decision 40 years ago about what to tell me and what to carry privately. She made it the way she made all decisions, carefully, with full consideration of what served everyone involved. I am not going to be upset with her for it. She trusted the truth to find its way. It found its way. Patricia was quiet for a moment. She said, she really was something, your mother. I said, yes, she really was. I went back to the hospice on Thursday. Walter was sitting up slightly more than he had been the previous week, which the nurses said was not a reliable indicator of anything, but which I noted anyway. He looked at me when I came in with the same careful attention he had brought to every interaction since the conversation had opened between us. I sat down without being asked. That had changed. I no longer waited for an invitation. I said, I have questions, if you are willing. He said, I expected you would. I asked about Edward Marsh, about the specific nature of the legal process, about whether Walter had any documentation, any record, anything that could clarify the chain of connection for Patricia's review. He said he had nothing in writing. The network had operated on trust and verbal agreement precisely because documentation created risk. What he could offer was his account, and his account was available to be given to whoever needed it, in whatever form was useful. I said, Patricia, my attorney, may want to speak with you. He said, I am not going anywhere. He said it with the particular dry humor of a man in a hospice who has made peace with his circumstances and can afford to be wry about them. I said, there is something else I want to ask you. He waited. I said, my mother, in the years after the adoption, in the years you saw her occasionally at community events and garden shows, how did she seem to you? As a person, as a mother? He looked at the window for a moment. He said, complete. That is the word I always thought of when I saw Dorothy in those years. She seemed like a person who had arrived at completeness. Not smugness, completeness. The satisfaction of someone who has the life they were supposed to have and knows it. He said, she spoke about you occasionally. Not in the detailed way of parents who make their children the primary content of every conversation. In the way of someone who mentions something because it is a natural part of who they are, and they see no reason to omit it. She mentioned your work once. You were teaching at the time. She mentioned something you had said that she found funny. The specific details I don't remember. The impression I have is of a woman who was proud of you in the uncomplicated way of someone who has watched something grow well and feels satisfied with the growing.
I said, she never discussed the other dimension, what she knew about Cecile. He said, never, not once, in 40 years of occasional encounters. If she had come to know more about the circumstances of your birth, she carried it with the same discipline she carried everything she had decided was hers to carry. I said, Agnes, the woman I told you about, the woman in room 7, she said my mother knew Cecile's name, that at some point Dorothy had found out. Walter said, I believe that. I believe she investigated when she was ready to investigate and found what she found and decided what to do with it. What she decided was to do nothing that would introduce complication into a life that was going well. She had you. You were hers. The biological history was real, but it was not, in her assessment, something you needed to pursue in order to be complete. He said, she may have been wrong about that assessment. You seem to have needed it eventually. I said, she wasn't wrong exactly. I didn't need it for a long time. When I needed it, it found me. She trusted that. I think she always trusted that. He looked at me. He said, you are very like her, you know. I said, people keep telling me that. I'm beginning to understand what they mean. He said, it is the quality of receiving difficult things without being destroyed by them. Dorothy had it. She could absorb something hard and continue. Not without feeling it. She felt things thoroughly, but the feeling did not stop the continuing. I looked at the window. I said, I have had considerable practice. He said, I know. I followed what happened to you, after your husband. I saw some of it in the news, and I read what became public. I thought about calling. I had Dorothy's number, which I suppose had become your number after she died. I thought about reaching out to say, I'm not sure what, that I was sorry, that Dorothy had been proud of you, that the way you handled things would have made her proud in a particular way. He said, I didn't call. It seemed like an intrusion. You were managing something enormous, and a call from a man you had never met who claimed to know your dead mother seemed like the wrong addition to an already complicated situation. I said, you were right not to call then. This was the right time. He said, yes, I think so too. I left the hospice that afternoon with a particular feeling of something having been placed correctly. Not resolved, there was nothing to resolve. The adoption was legal. My mother's decision to keep certain things private was hers to make, and she had made it with the care she brought to everything. Walter's knowledge was now mine. The picture was complete in the way pictures become complete when the final piece arrives, and you understand that the shape you had been living with was already essentially right, only missing this one corner. I drove home in the October afternoon and sat in the garden until the light was gone. I thought about Dorothy at a garden show 2 years before she died, saying to a man she saw occasionally across 4 decades, if you find yourself with the opportunity, tell her what you know. She had trusted the opportunity to arise. She had been, as she was in all things, correct. Patricia spoke with Walter the following Tuesday. She drove to the hospice herself, which she did not have to do, and which told me something about how she understood the significance of what he held. She brought a small recorder, with Walter's permission, and a legal pad, and the focused attentiveness she brought to everything that required it. She was with him for 2 hours. She called me afterward from her car in the hospice parking lot, which was where she always seemed to call me from when she had been inside and needed to process what she had found. She said,
His account is consistent with what was legally possible in that period and in that jurisdiction. Private adoption facilitation of the kind he describes existed in a gray area that was not specifically illegal and was not specifically regulated. The formal adoption was processed entirely through Horace Finney with proper documentation. There is no legal issue with your adoption. It was complete and valid when it was completed, and nothing Walter has said changes that. I said, I know. I was not worried about the legality. She said, I know you weren't, but I needed to confirm it. She said, there is something else he told me that I want to share with you. I said, tell me. She said, he told me that Dorothy knew, not just a name. He said in his assessment, Dorothy had found out the full circumstances of your birth, Cecile's situation, the manner in which Edward Marsh had connected the two families, everything. He said he believes she found this out in her 50s, when you were in your 30s, and that she had spent the following decades carrying it. I said, that is consistent with what Agnes told me, and with what I believe about my mother.
Patricia said, he said something else. He said Dorothy told him at the garden show more than just the instruction to tell you if the opportunity arose. He said she told him, Eleanor will have found her own way to most of this by the time you speak to her. She always does. What she will need from you is the piece she cannot find on her own, the piece about how she came to us. I was quiet for a moment. She had known. Dorothy Crawford, 2 years before her death, had known that I would find my way to Cecile and Robert and Miriam through the channels available. She had known that the sealed adoption records were not the obstacle they appeared to be, that Agnes, or someone like Agnes, would fill that gap. She had trusted the network of connected truths to surface. What she had understood would not surface on its own was the mechanism. Edward Marsh, the informal network, the specific human connection that had made the official process possible. That piece lived only in Walter. She had made sure Walter would give it to me. In her own time, in her own way, on her own terms. I said, she managed this from a garden show 2 years before she died. Patricia said, it appears so. I said, of course she did. Walter declined when I asked him the following Thursday any formal documentation of his account beyond what he had given Patricia in her recording. He said, I have said what I needed to say. What you do with it is yours. I don't need to be part of the record any more than I already am. I said, is there anything you need? From me? From anyone? He looked at me with the slight surprise of a man who had not expected the question. He said, you have already given me what I needed. I said, which was? He said, to know that the thing I held for 40 years mattered to the person it was held for. I didn't know until you sat down in that chair 3 weeks ago whether you would want it. I didn't know if it was something you had already found, or something you had actively avoided, or something that would cause harm rather than whatever the opposite of harm is. I said, completion. He said, yes, that. He said, Dorothy told me you were well. I wanted to see that for myself before I was no longer able to see anything. I have seen it. That is what I needed. I visited Walter every Thursday for the next 6 weeks, not always with significant conversation, often with tea and the comfortable silence of 2 people who have said what needed saying and are simply occupying the same space in the ordinary way. He told me, in pieces, about his life. Not a dramatic life by conventional measure. He had been a surveyor.
He had been married once, briefly, in his 30s. He had no children by choice, a choice he said he had never regretted and did not regret now. He had lived in the same town in Connecticut for 50 years. He had a vegetable garden that a neighbor was maintaining in his absence and which he expected to return to in the spring, with the particular optimism of a man who understands that expecting to return to the garden in spring is a form of living fully in the present. He did not return to the garden in spring. He died on a Tuesday in December, 6 weeks after our first real conversation. Quietly, the nurses said in his sleep, with the particular peacefulness of a man who had finished what he had come to finish and did not require more time. I was not with him when he died. I had been the previous Thursday and had brought the strong tea he had come to expect, and we had talked for an hour about the surveyor's relationship to landscape, the specific intimacy of a person who has spent a lifetime measuring the exact dimensions of the physical world and who has, in that measuring, developed a relationship with land that most people never achieve. He had seemed, that Thursday, like a man at the end of a long conversation who has reached the natural pause before the next one. I attended his small funeral. The social worker from the hospice was there, the nurse who had managed his care, 2 people from the town where he had lived for 50 years, whose connection to him I did not fully understand, but who stood at the graveside with the quiet presence of people who had known him at the edges of a long life and found those edges worth honoring. I stood at the back. I thought about a man who had held a piece of someone else's story for 40 years because a woman he admired had asked him to, who had held it faithfully, without using it, without seeking acknowledgement for holding it, who had arrived at a hospice in September and waited 3 weeks for the right moment. There is a particular kind of faithfulness that asks nothing of the person it serves, that operates entirely for the benefit of the other and expects no recognition and receives none until the very end, when recognition is no longer the point. Walter Oakes had been faithful in that way. Dorothy Crawford had known he would be.
She had chosen well, as she always chose well. I drove home from the funeral in the December afternoon and sat at the kitchen table and called Lucas. I said, "Walter died this week." He said, "I know. You mentioned he was close. Are you all right?" I said, "Yes. I am grateful. For him and for my mother, who trusted that he would find his way to me." Lucas said, "She trusted a lot of things to find their way to you." I said, "She always said the right things find each other eventually." I am beginning to think she was not speaking philosophically. I think she was describing a method. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That sounds exactly like her." I said, "Yes, it sounded exactly like her." It is January. The garden is in its deepest winter. Not the tentative, bare patience of early November, but the committed stillness of January. Everything underground, everything waiting. The soil doing the slow, invisible work that produces spring without any visible evidence that the work is occurring. I continue the Thursday shift at the hospice. New patients arrive. New rooms turn over. I bring tea to people who want company and sit quietly beside people who do not. I have become, over the past year, one of the longer-serving volunteers on the Thursday rotation, which means the newer volunteers sometimes ask me questions, and I answer them as honestly as I can. Last week, a new volunteer asked me, "How do you stay present when it is hard? How do you remain in the room with it?" I thought about the question seriously before answering because it deserved a serious answer. I said, "You stop requiring the difficult thing to resolve before you can be with it. You allow it to be difficult, and you remain present with the difficulty rather than waiting for it to become something easier." That is the whole skill. It sounds simple. It is not simple. But it is learnable. She asked, "How do you learn it?" I said, "Practice. Circumstances that require it. And eventually, the understanding that the things you have remained present with, the hard ones, the ones you could not resolve, those are the things that have told you who you are. The easy things don't teach you much about yourself. The difficult ones do." She seemed to find this useful. I hope she did. Robert called from Vermont last week. He and Lucas have begun the porch project. They started the planning in November, and the materials are ordered, and they will begin building in March when the ground is workable. Robert said, "I think this is the start of something. The building, I mean. Lucas and I working together. I think we will find other things to build." I said, "I think so too." Miriam sent a letter, a physical letter, which she has taken to doing occasionally, having discovered that she enjoys the form. She described her children's winter activities and a difficult case at work and a book she had read that she thought I would like. At the end, she wrote, "I keep thinking about what Agnes said, that the right things find each other when the time is right. I think that's true. I think we found each other at the right time." I wrote back, "Yes, I think we did." Dorothy Crawford trusted that the right things would find each other. She arranged, at a garden show 2 years before her death, for the final piece of my story to be given to me by a man who had held it faithfully for 40 years. She did this without telling me she had done it. She trusted that the arrangement would work and the time would come. She was right. She was, in my experience of her, always right about the things that mattered. If there is something I want to say about Walter Oakes and what he gave me, it is this. The people who hold things on our behalf, who keep the difficult pieces of our stories safe until we are ready for them, those people are performing an act of extraordinary faithfulness. They ask nothing. They hold the thing and they wait. They trust that the moment will come when the holding has served its purpose and the giving can begin. We do not often know when someone is holding something for us. We do not often know that they exist. We live our lives without awareness of the patient faithfulness of people at the edge of our story. But they are there. And when the moment comes, when the man in room 11 looks up from the window and says a name we recognize, what is required of us is simply to sit down and listen. Dorothy knew this. She built my entire life on the trust that it was true. I am 62 years old, and I have been volunteering at a hospice for 13 months, and a man I had never met asked about my dead mother by name and told me the last piece of what I needed to know. The garden is in January. The work is happening underground where I cannot see it. By spring, it will have produced something. It always does.
Leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if there is someone in your life who has been holding something for you without your knowledge. Tell me if you have found out. Tell me what it gave you. I read every single one.